right? The rich versus the poor, quote unquote, the have versus the have-nots. And when I think about this whole thing that happened 2 years ago, you know, it was just a little thing, you know, like the almost total collapse of the world economy. I was thinking to myself, how seriously do we as Americans take this? And part of the reason why that question is out there is because we're still in the process of negotiating, you know, Wall Street reform. And there's been some kind of movement in this particular direction in the Senate, and I want to kind of talk about that movement and what role should we as individuals be playing in that movement toward Wall Street reform.
Yeah, fortunately, the Senate passed the bill. I think it was 59-39. So, you know, overwhelmingly, you know, it is something that everybody's looking for. And I think while some of the Democrats, you know, were hesitating to or declined to give their vote, I think it was for the most part because they didn't think the bill went far enough.
Right.
But overall, I guess there is a consensus that something needed to be done. So now we're at the point now where they need to reconcile both the House bill and the Senate bill to make sure that they're all they're all coordinated with the same values and beliefs. And I think it's actually really wonderful because the things that it's done are the things that needed to be done. And while you can always go further, you know, you got to take baby steps sometimes. And the things that did pass in it appear to address some of the major issues that we already have.
Well, let's talk about some of the major issues. There's certain things that are out there that are called derivatives, which none of us, you know, swaps, all of these things that we don't have an understanding about. And how has that been addressed within the Senate bill?
Well, the derivatives there's actually a double-edged sword. You know, the way it hasn't gone far enough is that it still allows banks and large financial institutions to continue trading them. You know, it doesn't put any restrictions on how the banks earn their income, and so they can continue to do that. But the positive thing is now it's going to be more publicly watched. You know, you're able to oversee what's going on in the transaction, and I'm sure, since a lot of people had absolutely no idea what it was, including the people trading it, now most people are going to have a better idea of exactly what's going on as they watch it.
Now, one of the big things that a lot of people have been looking at is this whole idea of consumer protection. Who's going to be the one doing this, and what kind of protections are going to be out there? Have they increased the power to certain departments and less in other departments?
Yeah, they've actually appointed an agency, a consumer protection agency, that's going to oversee a lot of the issues that are connected to, you know, the general public and you know, consumer-related issues, which is also a good thing. Whether or not they exercise their right, you know, their right of oversight as stringently as they should is yet to be seen, because like we've talked about in the past, there's a lot of things on the books that aren't really taken care of. And there's also situations that we've again also talked about where, you know, one loophole is closed and another one opens up, and they just keep finding other ways to kind of, you know, work around the system.
Like, for example, one of the things that people talked about, and I'm jumping around in terms of the bill itself, but the whole idea of predatory lending. They're going to try to bring that underneath more of a focus. And you would think that was common sense in the first place. You think that someone should have been watching that previously. One of the things that they were talking about also within the dealing with predatory lending was dealing with automobiles, like the unscrupulous loans that people were giving out to individuals or whatever, and how they actually targeted certain communities. Unfortunately, majority of those communities of color, and then how they actually going to provide more safeguards. Because actually, what the auto industry was fighting against this particular aspect of the bill, because they thought it was going to deter people from going out and buying cars.
Yeah, and regarding the mortgages, I think, fortunately or maybe unfortunately, the Federal Reserve is going to maintain their ability to oversee the entire situation with the banks, and hopefully they'll do more, since they missed the burst of the housing bubble and a lot of other things that might have helped us if we had known a little earlier. But they're going to have the authority to watch some of these practices in terms of whether or not there's transparency in lending, and whether or not mortgages are fair mortgages and things like that. Well,
let's look at one of the biggest failures, I think, of the bill. We talked about it previously on the show, too big to fail. You know, again, the aspect of them breaking up these big multinational corporations and stuff, which dominate the gross domestic product, they're not going to do anything about that.
Well, and slightly. I mean, one of the things that they are going to be able to do is they're going to be able to figure out ways to more easily liquidate some of these corporations that are failing, you know, and at that point they're able to oversee, you know, the liquidation a little bit more closely. But again, like you said, you know, there's no strong regulation about making sure that we don't have those major collapses that we, you know, had for companies like AIG and Lehman Brothers.
Just like with the whole idea with the Pension Benefits Guarantee Fund, there's been an idea floated within the House and the Senate about having a fund set up and established so that we don't have to come out of our pockets as taxpayers, and they seem to be fighting against that whole idea also. I think the House was somewhere about, I think it was $50 billion, and the Senate wanted $150 billion to be set aside by these firms so that they would have cash reserves against any incidents that happen. And that, I think that makes common sense.
Yeah. Well, a lot of things, like I said, a lot of things are more like baby steps, because even like you mentioned, you know, with mortgages, some people wanted them to address the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac situation,
Right.
but they figured if they started throwing that in, that it would, you know, bring the bill to a halt, and they really wanted to get something passed. So, you know, it is a little bit, and it's probably not enough, but it is something positive in terms of, for two reasons. You know, it's addressing a couple of the issues, you know, in steps, and also I think it's admirable of the president to step up and say, basically, to those lobbyists, you see how much money you spent and it didn't make a difference. You know, we have a conviction that we need to make sure that what happened 2 years ago doesn't happen again, and we're not going to let the pressure from the lobbyists dissuade us.
Well, I think part of that is that the American people were fed up. I mean, we looked at the polls and the numbers out there. American people don't think that anything has been done to Wall Street.